I'm Robert Martinez, state historian of New Mexico. Let's talk New Mexico history. One of the stories I often hear from people is that the King of Spain granted my family land hundreds of years ago. Well, that's not quite how it happened. Land grants in New Mexico were granted as part of a greater machinery of Spanish colonial empire that extended around the world. It was very hierarchical. The King of Spain did not sit on his throne at the Escorial outside of Madrid, granting people in New Mexico land. He wasn't sitting there with documents in front of him and a writing utensil saying, I grant Bartolome Romero land in Nuevo Mexico. I grant Luis Martin Serrano land in San Gabriel, Nuevo Mexico. That's not what was happening. He had bigger fish to fry. He had a world empire to oversee and wealth to accumulate from places like Mexico, Peru, and the Manila trade. No, New Mexico was on the edge of empire, and there was a whole system of hierarchy that had to be navigated to get land granted in places like northern New Mexico in the 1600s, 1700s, and early 1800s. Here's how it worked. The King of Spain would grant that authority to the viceroy in Mexico City. He then would grant that authority to the governors in the outlying areas of Nueva España and to places like New Mexico. There, the governor would then grant land to people. That's how it worked. There was no direct contact with the King of Spain. He probably had no idea, frankly, what was going on in New Mexico, or very little. Again, he had other bigger empire issues to deal with. So in a place like New Mexico, someone would petition the governor in Santa Fe for land along the Rio Chama or along the Rio Grande or in the mountains in northern New Mexico. He would review the petition, then he would either grant it or deny it. There was a whole process of how you took possession of the land. You would, in the presence of the governor or one of his workers, one of the people he would send to witness this event, the person and probably family members or community members would pick up some land, some of the earth, the land they were being granted, and throw it in the air and take possession of the land in the name of the king. This is probably where this idea comes down to us, that the king himself granted the land. I mean, the king did grant the land indirectly through the viceroy, through the governor, and to the people of New Mexico. And there were documents that were kept to prove possession of land. Land was measured in varas, something like 3 yards more or less. And it wasn't always done in a grid, maybe the way we're used to measuring land today. They might measure the land from the river to a tree, to the top of a hill, back to the river. And the person had to occupy and use the land. You couldn't own a bunch of land grants all over New Mexico while you lived in Santa Fe. I mean, you might have parts of an estate, but you had to work the land. It couldn't stay idle or you would lose that land grant. Also, it wasn't land possession in the American sense of the word. When you buy land in our system, you own that land. No, the king was sovereign, and the king ultimately owned all the land. If gold or silver was found on your land grant, it wasn't your gold and silver. It belonged ultimately to the monarch. So that's how that worked as well. So it's quite an amazing system. There was also common lands where a person who had a land grant or a community who had a land grant, there were communal land grants, they would have access to common lands for hunting, for access to wood, and access to natural resources so everyone could live. Even if you weren't a member of a land grant, you could still access the land so you could survive. So this is another idea that was very Spanish, and it also goes into the Mexican period. What happens during the Mexican period, 1821 to 1846, is not only do governors grant Mexican land grants like Mora or Las Vegas, but they also allow the local magistrates, alcaldes mayores, the local leaders in towns like Santa Cruz de la Cañada, they could also grant land to people. So here we go. That same system that you see under Spain continues, though a bit different, under the Mexican system. That authority, again, no longer from Spain, comes from Mexico City. So these land grants are in place. The Pueblo people also have their land that are land grants granted during the colonial period. They already had their towns, their pueblos, established when the Spanish arrived in the 1500s and 1600s. So their land base is essentially protected more or less, although the Pueblo people also had their own way of defining land ownership and borders. So the Spanish had a system for the pueblos called 4 square leagues, essentially from the center of the pueblo, a league in each direction for the pueblo. And of course, that shape would shift depending on natural boundaries or mountains and rivers or other pueblos that were adjacent to that pueblo. There was a lot of strife during the colonial period and into the Mexican period over who owned what land. Hispanic people regularly would encroach on Pueblo land. Pueblos would fight back in the court system, even going to places like Guadalajara or Mexico City to fight for their land. There were also conflicts pueblo to pueblo. It was a very human experience. Things also start to change, though, as far as land grants when Americans come, when lawyers come, when the American system of land ownership and land borders is brought from the East. New Mexicans never knew of barbed wire to define land borders until Americans came. And it was quite a shock when barbed wire started to go up and Americans started to come, encroaching on land as well, squatting on land. And there was a lot of confusion and legal wrangling and stealing of land. The Pueblos, amazingly, because of their cruzate land grants dating back centuries, were able to maintain their land base. There's some question as to where those land grants came from because they're ancient and in pretty good condition. Many of the Hispanic people had their land grants, but they didn't have the original papers. They might have a copy or not have a piece of paper at all, and the Americans insisted that a piece of paper be provided as proof of land access or land ownership. The Pueblo Cruzate land grants, wherever they came from, proved their land base. They were able more or less to keep their land, although there were legal challenges to their land as well, even into the 20th century. Even into the 20th century, there were challenges. The Bursum Bill was an attempt to impose on Pueblo lands. So this is how land grants still define New Mexico history. The courthouse raid at Tierra Maria of 1967, led by Reyes Lopez Tijerina, brought to light New Mexico's land grant history and our deep roots here, both for the Hispano people and the Puebloan people, as well as Apache Navajo people. It's an amazing story that's not just in history, it's still with us today, and it's still defining who we are and how we interact with each other and with the land. Well, I hope this has been helpful. Stay tuned for more episodes. We'll talk to you later. Hasta luego. Bye.